Hey everyone, this is the FYI on Youth Ministry, a youth ministry podcast from the Fuller Youth Institute. This season, we are focusing on discipleship that forms Christ-like characteristics. In today's episode, we talk about hip-hop and forgiveness in the context of racial justice. So, how is hip-hop related to forgiveness? And how can it help us teach our students about racial justice? Keep listening to find out. But first, let's hear what young people had to say about forgiveness.
My name is Frank, and I am 14.
My name is Calvin, and my age is 18.
My name is Debbie. I am 17 years old.
What does forgiveness mean?
This is like a simplistic definition, I guess, but I would say not staying mad at someone even though it doesn't have any benefit for you.
Forgiveness is like you accept that person, what he did wrong to you, and they won't do it again.
For me, it means like forgiving those who have hurt you. I know I should be forgiving people who have hurt me, but I don't do it because they still are hurting me a lot at this point. Mm-hmm. And by me not forgiving them, I'm just building up the emotion that I have towards that person, and it's really not okay. I should be talking to that person and be like, hey, I don't like this, what you're doing. Can you stop it? Because I'm hurting myself from you harming me.
Hello everyone, this is Roslyn Hernández and I am Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager and Content Producer at the Fuller Youth Institute, and I am accompanied today by a new host.
Hey everybody, my name is Dr. LaTasha Nesbitt. I am the Research Director here at the Fuller Youth Institute. The Christ-like characteristic that we're talking about today is the F word, oh my goodness, forgiveness. And in this episode, we're looking at forgiveness in the context of popular culture and racial justice. As we already know, racial justice is one of the most important issues of Gen Z. So today's guest will share how popular culture, like hip hop, can help us understand and cultivate forgiveness and racial justice with our students.
That's right. I am so honored and delighted to introduce our guest today. Our guest is Dr. Dwight Radcliff. Dwight is Academic Dean for the William E. Pennell Center for Black Church Studies, and he's also Assistant Professor of Mission Theology and Culture at Fuller Theological Seminary. And I'd like to plug something today because Dwight is also the chair of the Masters of Arts in Justice and Advocacy here at Fuller. I'd just like to say that this is a great program. It is fully online. And Dwight is one of the great faculty members who teaches in this program. Dwight is also a husband, pastor, mentor, and father. And more specifically with that, which is something I like to highlight, Dwight is actually a girl dad.
Yay!
I am 1,000% hashtag girl dad all day.
Hashtag girl dad. I love that. So welcome.
Thank you. I have to come back around here. You guys are making me feel good.
Anytime. So, Dwight, in this season, we are opening with a more personal question. So, do you remember a time when your daughters or another young person taught you something about forgiveness?
Yeah. Let's see how personal I can get and not be kicked out of my house. One of my daughters and the relationship right now is teaching me something about forgiveness. I will confess I have not mastered this yet. I remember having a conversation with my oldest, and I was saying something to the effect that I'm trying to protect you from this thing or this whatever this thing was. And I remember her telling me, she said something along the lines like, are you doing it to protect me, or are you doing it because you think you need to? And we had this long conversation, and I had to come to grips with the fact that my quote unquote need or desire to protect is not always born out of a honest place of parental concern, that sometimes it is laced with my own understandings of manhood, of masculinity, of fatherhood. And some of that is great, but some of it is not so great. And so we had some conversations around where's the line between toxic masculinity, masquerading as the father, and where's the line, and the other side is as an actual concerned father. And so my daughters right now are 23 and 20. I've never parented 23 and 20-year-olds. So this is really, really new ground for my wife and I both, but specifically for me, it's trying to carve out a new relationship. It's trying to hear them, and they're constantly teaching me and pushing me beyond where I would probably just sit on my own.
That's so good. That's so good. Just as you're reflecting there, is just great to witness your openness to becoming a student, you know? That's what's up. Thank you for sure for
it's
sharing
hard, though.
that. Of course.
It's hard, though.
Of course.
It's hard, yeah.
Going a little further as we establish a general baseline of sorts. You mentioned this already. From your perspective as an African-American man, a pastor, and a father, when it comes to racial justice, how do you believe we as a culture and a church are misunderstanding that concept of forgiveness?
I have conversations repeatedly with Gen Z, late millennials, and there is somewhat of a cynicism with regard to, we're talking about forgiveness, and there's this foregrounding of race and racial reconciliation, racial relations. A lot of Black Gen Z, late millennials that I've engaged are very pessimistic about forgiveness in that area. To say they're struggling with it would imply that they want to do it and it's difficult. I don't know if all of them are even at a place where they want to do it. So forgiveness is really difficult right now within the particular population that you're talking about, because they see a history of inactivity, a recent history of inactivity with the church. And they see a continued, if not emboldened, anti-racial stance in many pockets of white Christian America. So it's really difficult for some of them to see past the one or two friends, allies that they have, to see this larger picture of forgiveness as a road to racial reconciliation, even within Christian Gen Z.
As you noted that, racial issues they're an important topic. They're not thrown under the rug. Gen Z wants to talk about it. As you emphasize that there's a struggle there, there's a tension there. For our listeners, they might see a passion for racial justice in their students, and that they'll find that there's a lot that we can learn from them. Our students also need help in understanding some aspect of this work of forgiveness. If we look at forgiveness in the context of racial justice and reconciliation as a process, how would you define or describe forgiveness?
Oh, I think I want to opt out of this whole podcast.
We got you now.
Yeah. So, first and foremost, we don't forgive because it's easy, because it's convenient, or because it's popular. We forgive as a biblical mandate that we have been forgiven, and so we operate in forgiveness. Now, as a person who has worked through my own trauma in several spaces of life. It is not always easy. But the second part is recognizing the humanity and the human capacities to deal with forgiveness and trauma. That the hard issues of forgiveness are not hard because we just don't want to. They're hard because there's trauma attached to that. It's easy to forgive the person who stepped on your shoe and said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," and they step down and wipe off your shoe. It's harder to forgive a group of people that have systematically oppressed, enslaved, brutalized, raped, and murdered your people for generations. That's a different forgiveness. It's one thing to forgive in a relationship where you break up with somebody, and it's a mutually understood, hey, this is not working. It's another thing to walk away from a relationship where you have been sexually and verbally assaulted and abused. Those are completely different scenarios. And so I think we have to, while we hear the biblical mandate of forgiveness, we have to give people space to understand that forgiveness is not always this overnight, that many times there are stages to unpacking and being healed from your trauma that have caused you to be in the place that you're in. And so for me, I believe those steps are part of our obedience to the biblical mandate of forgiveness. That forgiveness is not just the end goal. Did you get to a place where you're finally healed? It's also in the steps that you take to get there. I've got a cut on my thumb right there, kind of right there. So years ago, I was washing dishes and I was wiping the inside of a glass and the glass broke. And as I did this motion, the glass just sliced my thumb open. And so, it was about trying to stop the bleeding at first. The next phase was to cover it so that it had time to heal. But what happened was down the road, as it started healing and scabbing over, every once in a while, because it's my right hand, I would reach in my pocket to get my keys or something. And I would hit it. And I would have a visceral, painful reaction, even though the bleeding had stopped, and even though it had been covered, and even though there was some time that had passed, every time I hit it, it would hurt. And then there was a time where it actually healed to where it didn't hurt anymore, but I would stick my hand in my pocket and I would remember that it used to hurt. And I would snatch my hand out and scream or something, even though there was no pain. So I had to go through all of these stages of healing to where I get to a point where I hit it and it doesn't hurt anymore and I don't respond anymore. The long part of what I'm saying is the forgiveness is not just the end result. It is also the journey, because we enter into journeys. And this is where we lose a lot of our young people, because we're so busy talking about the end result and they are locked into the process. And if we don't acknowledge the pain and the difficulty of the process, because for sake of the end result, we'll lose them.
So good.
Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
So good.
So when we think about forgiveness as a journey, we see that there are steps that get us to forgiveness and that get us closer to justice and eventually to reconciliation. And in that journey, we can draw from theology, we can draw from our Christian traditions, but we can also draw from pop culture. And for you and for others in the African American community, hip hop has been part of that racial justice journey. And here we want to, I want to mention just really quickly that you actually wrote your dissertation on hip hop hermeneutics. And so if anyone wants to check that out, you can go to our show notes page and we'll have that linked for you. And we also want to, I think maybe do a little disclaimer here that we're not going to tell you go listen to hip hop in your youth ministry, but we are telling you what we can learn from hip hop that can help us reach our young people in our youth ministry. So I get to ask the question that many listeners might be asking from the title of this podcast. What does hip hop have to do with forgiveness? So what can we learn from hip hop when it comes to truth telling in the journey of forgiveness?
I think the first thing, you have to understand that hip hop culture is birthed in a very specific context and time in the history of this nation. We're talking about the Bronx, New York. In the late 60s and early 70s, there was still a lot of racial tension all over the US, but specifically within this part of New York. Hip hop culture is introduced initially as escapism, but the beauty of hip hop culture is that it becomes a space for truth telling. Hip hop culture becomes the prophetic voice in our inner cities. They began to paint a picture of the reality of the worlds that they inhabited. And that truth telling, that ability to talk about recidivism, that ability to talk about unfair arrest, to talk about in an unjust justice system, that ability to talk about how horrible housing, that ability to talk about the fact that 911 is a joke in my town, to talk about these realities in ways that also allow people to still enjoy and have pride in where they're from. So the way that we get to forgiveness and reconciliation, you cannot get there without truth. So hip hop creates this space. It is unafraid to tell the truth. It is also unafraid to live in tension. There's a duality in hip hop that it talks about drug culture. It talks about, illegal activity, illicit activity. But at the same time, it's like, and you're going to go to jail and you're going to get shot and killed. And so the space becomes a space where we can ultimately get to forgiveness and reconciliation, but we can't do it without honesty and truth telling. And to keep it a buck, that's something that the church today is not really willing and able to do.
Yeah, that is so insightful. And I really appreciate that you mentioned that it is a space where things that seem that they're contradictory can exist at the same time and be held at the same time. And it's okay. It's not something that's incredibly radical or out of the norm. It's everyday life for these people that were writing these lyrics, that are living in los barrios, that are living in the neighborhoods where this type of stuff is happening. That's how life is for a large number of youth, particularly in urban areas, but it still is there are hardships and beauty in the reality of our students. Since we're clarifying things a little bit, I want to ask about this because this is something that might come up for people when we think about truth telling, specifically calling in or holding someone accountable as opposed to calling someone out, or what has come now to be known as cancel culture.
Cancel culture, yeah.
Yeah. So how do we navigate that, or what are the differences?
We have lost a capacity to have difficult, multi-layered conversations without demonizing the other side. So the cancel culture thing is real, because the moment I say something that is not politically correct, or the moment I say something that is harsh, I'm at the risk of being canceled. I met with some students earlier today, and I have them reading Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman, which I personally feel like you can't get to heaven unless you read this book. I think if you die before you read this book, you got to get held up in the hallway and they give you a copy and you sit there and read it until, that's my personal theological construct. But this is written in the late 40s, early 50s. And so some of the language is very patriarchal. So it's not fair for me to hold 1940s, 50 Howard Thurman to 2023 linguistic sensibilities. But it's okay to have the conversation that, hey, if Thurman were to write that today, it would sound different. There would be different elements to it. And so I think we just have to be able to give each other space to say, I disagree with you. Let's reason together. And then there may be some times where we just viscerally disagree, and that's okay too. But we have to, as Christians, we have to be the ones that begin to model, what does it mean to have difficult conversations? Can Christians who consider themselves quote unquote conservative and quote unquote liberal, can they as Christians sit down and have conversations over hot topics like sexuality, like gender identity, like race, like history? Can we have those conversations?
I think it speaks also to like calling someone in and holding someone accountable. Being accountable with someone is hard work and part of a journey.
Mm-hmm.
Very much a part of a journey for forgiveness.
It's harder to do when you don't have a relationship. It's easy for me to make assumptions about you based on the way I see you. I make immediate assumptions about your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your sexuality, your socioeconomic status. I make all these assumptions about you, but I don't know your story. We have to push past this surface understanding of people and really get into communion and community and conversation with people. So I do understand your story, because there might be a reason why you think the way you think and why you say what you say.
Yeah. I think the point you highlight is understanding our need for each other, because we live in such an independent society. It's like me, mine, I got to get mine. Even just going to the church, a lot of the times, Dr. Radcliff and Roslyn, we talk about wanting to move forward and heal. And even as we talk about this whole conversation of forgiveness, we just want to go in our own prayer closets and go straight to God. But there's some stuff that we have to talk through with people. Going back to this whole idea of hip hop's prophetic truth telling and the importance of that as we talk about this process of forgiveness. Just thinking about our listeners who have students and young people that they are have influence with. How do you think we can empower young people in the spirit of hip hop as it relates to prophetic truth telling? What are good ways to get them going in this life as far as empowerment?
Leaders have to be able to divest themselves of authority and become students. We have to be teachable. Yeah, you might know the Greek and the Hebrew and exegete the text, and you got the degrees and the experience, but there is something that they bring to the table, and we have to find ways of giving them space and giving them the microphone, as it were, and allowing them to lead. In Birmingham at Kelly Park, where we received these visceral images of the water hoses and the dogs, go back and look at the pictures. They did that to children. It was children that led that movement at Kelly Park, because the children realized, I don't have a job for you to fire me from. I don't have an apartment for you to kick me out of. And the children led that protest movement in Birmingham. The children, the teenagers, the young adults, they led it. And when they were holding on to tree branches, as one brother told us, holding on to tree branches, praying that the branch wouldn't break so that the dog wouldn't get him. When some were beaten and injured. And then the next day, hundreds of more came back. And they did it because they knew it was what they needed to be doing. So as leaders, we have to find ways of empowering, of listening, of learning, and then sometimes just getting the heck out the way. Whatever God is doing, Bishop Paul Moore said, Lord, whatever you're doing in this season, don't do it without me. We want to be so involved in what God is doing sometimes that we sometimes get in the way. And our young adults have voice, they have agency, they have intellect, they have thoughts, they have cares, and we have to learn. We have to learn the habit of listening to them and learning from them. I think that's going to be key for every leader. Yeah, you might have your program and your agenda and your syllabus and your funding from the big church, but you have to be able to listen and to be empower our young adults and our children.
It's a good word. We might have a tendency as youth leaders or pastors and think that we know better than they do.
Yeah.
But these
Of course
are
we do.
yeah, in some ways. They're very tech savvy people. They need to figure something out. They're gonna find it out some way or another. Like, I actually believe that they are cross-checking, like looking at what other people are saying, but through several different perspectives, not just one. I hear you. And sometimes we need to give students more props for how smart they are and how much passion they have. Along with passion, I wonder also about like practices, right? Of practices, spiritual practices that we can do with our students. And something that I'm particularly thinking about is lament, and how we often don't lament well in church or in our culture, in US culture. But yeah, reading laments, writing laments, the acrostics are is part of the lament tradition, or in even spoken word, just in learning about truth tellers in the Bible and in our cultures can be really helpful for students.
So this is where it's really important to understand hip hop culture. Much of hip hop is a prophetic lament. Like when you really read through the prophets and through the Psalms, when you really read through the Psalms, you begin to hear the same questions, these eternal questions. The psalmist said, how can we sing songs, Zion songs in a strange land? Tupac says, I wonder if heaven got a ghetto. Like these are the same questions that are being proposed to their current context. I feel like too much of majority culture Christianity only does lament. There are certain ways that majority culture church will hold hands and will cry, but won't do anything else. That's where the lament ends. And lament has to move us to something. If my life is not changed by the lament, then there's a problem. If we're not lamenting in ways that are staining us and moving us to different action, then we're not even honest in our lament. Michael Eric Dyson, I believe he was testifying before Congress, and he says this in one of his books. He says that people were so concerned about the profanity within hip hop culture that you were worried more about the cursed words than you were about the cursed worlds they inhabit. One of the problems we have with hip hop culture is the way things are sometimes said. But honestly, what's being said are the things that we should be concerned about people's humanity.
Hi, listeners. Before we continue with the interview, we want to offer this content warning. The following minute of this interview contains a reference to assault that may be difficult for trauma survivors.
I told our church when I went down this whole journey, trying to engage the church in hip hop culture, I said, this is what it's akin to. Hip hop culture is telling the truth about things that we're also concerned about. We just don't like the way they're saying it. It's like a woman is being assaulted outside the church and we're inside church having service. And we hear this woman screaming all kind of profanities and what have you. And we go outside and we see this woman being assaulted and we say, ma'am, we're going to help you. We want you to not be assaulted anymore. But first, I'm going to need you to stop with the profanity. Nobody in their right mind would do that. Everyone in their right mind would respond to the threat, to eliminate the threat. Jesus doesn't ask the woman with the issue of blood to give her to recite her catechism first. He doesn't, the man in the tombs, he doesn't ask this dude first to see his medical insurance. He doesn't ask the Syrophoenician woman first to denounce being a Canaanite. Like, Jesus responds to needs. And the moment the church understands that we have been called to be like Jesus, to respond to the hurts, the pains, and the needs of our communities and our contexts, even if those needs come to us wrapped up in words and expressions that we think are not orthodox. Who cares? Where's the pain point? Where's the problem? And what ought to be the church's response, the church's biblical response to the cause of the pain? That's the question that we need to ask ourselves. And that, to me, is why I listen to hip hop, even to this day. It's because it keeps me in tune with the pain points that I sometimes don't get to hear because everybody around me is talking churchanese.
Ooh, distracted by the discourse. You better preach.
I'm just saying.
I was like, do we have an extra hour?
Oh my goodness.
Hey. We'll do a part 2 after you get all the hate mail from this one.
Well, as we're getting ready to wrap up, we're getting to our lightning round. So now you're in the hot spot, okay? It wasn't before, it is now.
He ready. He stayed ready.
All right.
Those were easy questions.
Those were easy, huh?
Yeah. All right, so these are inspired by the interviews that we had with research participants about the characteristics that we studied. There are no right or wrong answers, so no pressure.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are. I know a setup when I see one. All right.
These are subjective, and we're looking for the first thing that pops into your head. One word or one sentence, 0 to little context. Okay?
All right.
Okay, here we go.
You got this.
There's only 6 of them. Okay, when you were a teenager, who taught you most about love?
I think I would say my mother and my godmother.
Okay.
Short answer, right? I'm not supposed to give context.
Yeah, short answer, yeah.
Yeah.
What is the greatest lesson you've learned about forgiveness?
That it's not for them.
Yeah.
Wow.
In this season of your life, compassion looks like?
Action.
Okay. What or who gives you hope?
The church.
Okay. And this is a trick question.
Uh-oh.
On a scale of 1 On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being low and 10 being high, how much humility do you have?
I say a 7.
All right. That's like one of the fastest answers we've gotten. People have waited a little bit longer to answer.
No. My girls keep me my girls keep me humble, but I know me.
Okay, here is the last one. When something is hard, what is a practice that helps you persevere?
Breathing.
Great. You got through them.
Good one. See, that was easy. He did that with easy.
Says you. Says you. Now I'm going to be thinking about all my answers for the next week. Like, man, somebody's going to think I said this. And all right.
In this season, we're asking our guests to help us wrap up each episode with a blessing. Dr. Radcliff, in light of our conversation, can you give us a benediction?
God, it's our prayer that we would hear the mandate for forgiveness, that we would find the mechanisms for forgiveness, and that we would reap the manifestation of forgiveness. In Christ's name, amen.
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 Thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
This podcast is one of the many free resources produced by the Fuller Youth Institute. Check out the show notes for links to all the resources mentioned in today's episode. And finally, here is one final thought from a young person.
When was the last time someone forgave you, or when you forgave somebody else?
I have to say when meeting a friend at a gym, like we plan to work out together, and we've been planning for days and days, and we finally found the day. And turns out on that day when you meet up, he didn't show up, and I've been texting that person and then telling him why he didn't show up and everything, but later on he didn't respond. And then till the next day, he explained the whole situation about why he didn't come to the gym and to meet me. seeing from what he explained everything, he had important things to do. Of course, I understand that, so I forgive him, and then he should have let me know sooner, so I don't have to bug him or worry about him, like why he didn't come, or and yeah.